Northern Montana, January 1891. The most respected builder in Flathead County stood in front of a half-finished cabin and said 5 words that would haunt him for decades. That thing will kill your family. He wasn't talking about poor craftsmanship. He was talking about the sheets of galvanized steel leaning against the wood frame, metal siding that the cabin's owner, a quiet homesteader named Edwin Cortland, planned to fasten over the entire exterior. Metal, the builder said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear, conducts cold straight through. You'll wake up with frost on the inside walls. It's dangerous. It's foolish. Edwin didn't argue. He just kept working. By March of that year, when the coldest recorded temperatures in Montana history locked the valley in a grip of ice and wind, Edwin's cabin would register 75 degrees warmer inside than his neighbors' homes. While families huddled around dying fires, burning through cords of wood in desperation, Edwin's stove burned slow and steady, consuming half the fuel and holding heat long after the flames went out. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea became the most copied. Subscribe now to get a real survival technique every week. Methods that worked when lives depended on it. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And stay until the end because the numbers that proved everyone wrong are almost unbelievable. Edwin Cortland wasn't trying to make history. He was trying to survive his 3rd Montana winter without losing his children to cold. The first 2 winters in Flathead County had taught him what every homesteader already knew. The standard log cabin, no matter how well chinked, was a losing battle against the northern cold. Wind found every seam. Frost crept through gaps in the logs. Families woke to ice on the inside of their walls. Men worked themselves to exhaustion cutting and hauling firewood, only to watch the heat vanish into the night. Edwin had done everything right. He'd built his cabin from seasoned lodgepole pine, 14 inches thick at the base. He'd chinked the gaps with clay and moss. He'd positioned the structure with a narrow end facing north to minimize wind exposure. He'd even installed a stone hearth with a proper firebox, just like the Territorial Extension Office recommended. And still, by December of 1890, his family was cold. His wife, Margaret, wrapped the children in every blanket they owned. His daughter, barely 6 years old, coughed through the nights. The wood consumption was staggering, nearly 4 cords a month, and they were only halfway through winter. Neighbors were in the same situation, some worse. The Halloran family, a quarter-mile east, had already lost a newborn to pneumonia. The standard method wasn't working. It never had. It was just what everyone did because no one knew what else to try. Edwin started asking a different question. What if the problem wasn't the cold getting in? What if it was the heat getting out? Log cabins, for all their rustic charm and pioneer mystique, were thermal sieves. Wood expanded and contracted with temperature swings. Gaps opened. Wind pressure forced cold air through cracks invisible to the eye. Even the best chinking dried and crumbled over time. The whole structure breathed, and every breath cost heat. Edwin had seen something in town that stuck with him. The grain storage building near the rail yard. It was clad in galvanized steel sheets, simple corrugated panels nailed over a wood frame. The building stayed dry inside, even during driving rain. The wind didn't penetrate. The structure didn't shift. What if he put metal over his cabin? Not instead of wood, over it. A second skin. An outer shell that didn't crack, didn't shift, didn't let wind through. Metal that could seal the cabin like a vault and reflect radiant heat back toward the interior instead of letting it bleed into the atmosphere. It was a radical idea. No one in the county had ever done it. Metal was for barns, silos, industrial structures, not homes. But Edwin wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in keeping his family warm. He spent weeks thinking through the mechanics. Metal conducted heat, yes, but also reflected it. If he could create a barrier that stopped wind infiltration completely while trapping a layer of still air between the metal and the logs, he'd have something no log cabin could match, a sealed thermal envelope. The air gap would act as insulation. The metal would act as armor, and the logs, protected from direct weather exposure, would remain stable and dry. The more Edwin thought about it, the more sense it made. Traditional cabins fought the weather with mass alone. Thick logs, heavy chinking, brute force. But they were passive systems, constantly losing the battle against wind and temperature swings. Edwin's design would be active, dynamic. It would work with physics instead of against it. In late December, he rode into Kalispell and bought 32 sheets of galvanized steel, 26 gauge, corrugated for strength. The hardware store owner asked if he was building a shed. Edwin said no. The man didn't ask again. By the first week of January 1891, Edwin had begun fastening the metal sheets to the outside of his cabin, leaving a 1-inch air gap between the steel and the logs. He nailed wooden furring strips vertically along the logs first, then attached the metal to the strips, creating a ventilated cavity. The metal overlapped at the seams, shingled from bottom to top to shed water and snow. It looked strange. It looked industrial. It looked nothing like a home. And Edwin didn't care, because he understood something the experts had missed. Thermal envelopes aren't about tradition. They're about physics. Edwin's design was deceptively simple, which made it easy to mock and hard to defend. The metal siding wasn't just nailed flat against the logs. That would have been a disaster. Moisture trapped between metal and wood, condensation with nowhere to go, rot setting in within months. Edwin knew that, so he created an air gap. Here's how it worked. He'd attached 1-inch thick furring strips vertically along the exterior of the cabin, spaced 16 inches apart. The galvanized steel sheets were then fastened to these strips, creating a continuous 1-inch cavity between the metal and the log walls. This cavity allowed air to circulate from bottom to top, carrying away any moisture that formed and preventing condensation from settling on the wood. The metal itself served 3 purposes. First, wind barrier. Corrugated steel, properly overlapped, created an airtight outer shell. Wind that would normally force its way through cracks and gaps in the logs now hit an impenetrable surface. The cabin's thermal envelope was sealed. Second, radiant heat reflection. Metal doesn't absorb infrared radiation the way wood does. It reflects it. Heat radiating outward from the interior logs hit the metal surface and bounced back toward the cabin. The air gap acted as an insulating buffer, trapping a layer of still air that resisted conductive heat loss. Third, structural protection. The metal shielded the logs from direct weather exposure. Rain, snow, ice, UV degradation. They would stay dry, stable, and intact. No expansion, no contraction, no cracking. In simple terms, the metal turned the cabin into a thermos. Heat generated inside stayed inside, reflected and retained by an outer shell that didn't leak, didn't shift, and didn't fail. But the people of Flathead County didn't see physics. They saw metal, and metal, everyone knew, conducted cold. "You're building an icebox," said James Hollister, a carpenter with 20 years of experience and a reputation as the county's most reliable builder. Metal conducts heat, or in this case, cold, straight through. You put steel on the outside of your cabin, and every degree of frost is going to transfer directly to your interior walls. You'll have ice forming on the inside by February. Hollister wasn't alone. The local sawmill foreman, a man named Dutch Kalb, stopped by Edwin's property just to see the full project for himself. He stood there shaking his head, hands on his hips, and said flatly, "That's going to rot your logs from the inside out. Condensation. You've trapped moisture between the wood and the metal with no way for it to dry. Give it 2 years, maybe less. Your whole structure will be punky and soft." The criticism wasn't just technical. It was personal. A cabin was supposed to look like a cabin, logs, visible and honest, weathered by the elements. It was a mark of self-sufficiency, of pioneer grit. Edwin's cabin, wrapped in industrial steel, looked like a storage shed. It looked cheap. It looked like he was trying to cut corners or hide poor craftsmanship. "Man builds a house that looks like a grain silo," muttered one of the neighbors. "You've got to wonder what he's compensating for." Even Margaret, Edwin's wife, had her doubts. She didn't say much, but Edwin could see it in the way she looked at the metal sheets, the way she hesitated when visitors asked about the construction. It wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't what anyone wanted. But Edwin had thought through the objections. He drilled small weep holes at the bottom of the metal panels to allow drainage. He'd left ventilation gaps at the top and bottom of the wall cavities to promote airflow. He'd treated the log ends with linseed oil to resist moisture. He wasn't guessing. He was engineering. The cost argument didn't hold up either. Yes, the metal sheets were expensive, nearly $40 for the full set, plus another $10 for the furring strips and fasteners. But Edwin calculated that he'd save that money back in reduced firewood consumption within 2 winters. A standard cabin burned 4 to 5 cords per season. If his design cut that in half, he'd save $20 a year in labor and hauling alone. The metal would pay for itself, and the logs would last decades longer without direct weather exposure. The aesthetics didn't concern him. Function over form had always been Edwin's philosophy. A cabin didn't need to look like everyone else's cabin. It needed to work. It needed to keep his family alive. If it looked like a grain silo, so be it. Pride didn't keep children warm. Physics did. Still, doubt hung over the project like smoke. The county's most experienced builders had declared it dangerous. The neighbors had declared it ugly. And winter was coming in hard, with temperatures already dropping below zero and the coldest months still ahead. If Edwin was wrong, his family would pay the price. If he was right, no one would believe it until they saw the proof with their own eyes. The criticism reached a peak in mid-January, during a community meeting at the Flathead Grange Hall. The meeting had been called to discuss winter preparedness and firewood distribution, a recurring issue in a county where families could burn through 5 cords of wood in a single brutal season. Edwin attended, mostly to listen. He didn't plan to bring up his cabin, but someone else did. James Hollister stood up during the open forum and addressed the room. "I want to talk about dangerous construction," he said, voice steady and certain. "There's a man in this room who's wrapping his cabin in galvanized steel. Metal siding. On a family home." Heads turned. Edwin felt the eyes on him, but kept his expression neutral. Hollister continued, "I've been building in this county for 2 decades. I've seen cabins fail for a dozen different reasons. Poor footings, green lumber, bad chinking. But I've never seen someone deliberately trap cold against their walls with a conductor like steel. That cabin is going to be colder inside than out. It's going to form ice on the interior surfaces. It's going to rot the structure and freeze the family. And when it fails, it's going to fail fast." There was a murmur of agreement. Hollister had credibility. People trusted him. An older man named Garrett Shaw, who ran a freight operation out of Kalispell, stood next. "I've seen metal buildings," he said. "Warehouses, storage sheds. They're cold as hell in winter. You touch the walls inside, your hand sticks to the frost. You put that around a home, you're not protecting your family. You're putting them in a freezer." Another voice from the back. "It doesn't even look right. Looks like he's ashamed of the logs. Like he's trying to hide them." Margaret, sitting beside Edwin, stiffened. Edwin reached over and gently rested his hand on hers. He didn't stand up. He didn't defend himself. He'd learned that defending an idea people hadn't seen work was a waste of breath. But the damage was done. By the end of the meeting, the consensus was clear. Edwin Cortland's metal-sided cabin was a disaster waiting to happen. People started referring to it as the silo or Cortland's icebox. A few neighbors made jokes about whether Edwin was planning to store grain or livestock inside. The social cost was real. Invitations to community gatherings became less frequent. When Edwin rode into town for supplies, conversations stopped. He wasn't shunned outright, but he was marked. The man who'd done something reckless, something outside the bounds of accepted practice. Margaret bore the worst of it. Other women at the church mentioned, in carefully polite tones, how unique the cabin looked. One woman asked, with genuine concern, whether Margaret felt safe living in a structure that hasn't been tested. Another suggested, kindly, that maybe Edwin could remove the metal in the spring before it caused real harm. The message was clear. Edwin wasn't just building wrong. He was failing as a husband and father by putting his family at risk for an unproven experiment. Even the children felt it. Edwin's son, just 8 years old, came home one afternoon and asked, "Papa, is our house going to freeze us?" Edwin knelt down and looked his son in the eye. "No," he said. "It's going to keep us warmer than any house in the county. You'll see." The isolation wore on Margaret more than she let on. She'd grown up in a tight-knit community in Wisconsin, where neighbors helped neighbors without question. Here, in Montana, that same spirit had existed until Edwin built his metal walls. Now, when she walked to the general store, conversations felt strained. Women who'd once invited her for tea now offered only polite nods. The unspoken message was clear. Your husband made a choice that put him outside the circle of trust. One Sunday after church, an older woman named Mrs. Pendleton approached Margaret with what seemed like genuine concern. "Dear," she said softly, "I know Edwin means well, but metal and winter, they don't mix. My late husband built cold storage sheds with metal. They were like ice boxes inside. If you need a place to stay, if things get too cold, our door is open." Margaret thanked her politely, but the offer stung. It wasn't kindness, it was pity, and worse, it was an assumption that Edwin had failed before the test had even begun. But doubt, once planted, is hard to uproot, and the real test was still ahead. The winter of 1891 became the coldest in Montana's recorded history. By late January, temperatures in Flathead County plunged to 35 degrees below zero, a cold so severe that sap froze inside standing trees and split them open with cracks like rifle shots. The wind, steady and relentless out of the north, drove the wind chill even lower. Snow fell in waves, burying fences and pathways, isolating homesteads for days at a time. Firewood, the lifeblood of winter survival, became a desperate concern. Families burned through their stockpiles faster than anticipated. Men worked from dawn to dusk, cutting and splitting frozen logs, hauling loads back to their cabins on sleds. The effort was exhausting and, for some, unsustainable. Cabins that had seemed solid in the fall began to show their weaknesses. Gaps between logs, invisible in moderate weather, became channels for frigid air. Chinking cracked and fell away. Frost formed on the interior walls, creeping across the logs in intricate, crystalline patterns. Families stuffed rags and old blankets into the gaps, but the cold found a way through. The Halloran family, whose infant had died earlier in the season, abandoned their cabin entirely and moved in with relatives closer to town. The Schaefer family, a mile south of Edwin's property, burned through 6 cords of wood in 3 weeks and still couldn't keep their main room above 40 degrees. Mrs. Schaefer developed frostbite on her fingers from handling frozen laundry. People stopped mocking Edwin's cabin. They were too busy trying to survive their own. But they noticed something. Smoke rose from Edwin's chimney, thin and steady, but infrequent. He wasn't burning fire around the clock like everyone else. His woodpile, stacked neatly outside the cabin, barely seemed to shrink. And when neighbors passed by, rare given the isolation of the storm, they didn't see the frantic activity of a family struggling to stay warm. They saw calm, routine. One evening, during a brief break in the weather, Dutch Kalb rode past Edwin's property on his way back from checking a trapline. It was well after dark. He expected to see the glow of a roaring fire through the cabin's window, the kind of blaze every family was maintaining just to keep the cold at bay. Instead, he saw soft, steady lamplight. No roaring fire. No desperation. Kalb stopped his horse and stared. The cabin looked almost serene. The metal siding, coated in frost, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. There was no smoke from the chimney at all. The fire had been banked hours ago. He didn't knock. He just rode on, troubled by what he'd seen. Or rather, by what he hadn't seen. By early February, the temperature dropped again. -40, then -43. The county had never recorded cold like this. Livestock froze in their barns. Water inside homes turned to ice overnight, even near the stove. The Kalispell newspaper ran a front-page story warning residents to check on neighbors and consolidate households where possible. James Hollister, the builder who'd condemned Edwin's design, was burning 5 cords a week to keep his family above freezing. His hands were raw from splitting wood. His children slept in layers, huddled together under piles of blankets. The interior walls of his cabin were slick with frost. And then, on February 9th, someone finally asked the question no one had wanted to voice. How is Cortland's family doing? The question came from Pastor William Gaines, who'd been making rounds to check on isolated families. He'd visited the Schaefers, the Hollerans, the Breckenridges, all struggling, all burning through wood at unsustainable rates, all showing signs of cold-related illness. But he hadn't been to the Cortlandt place yet, the metal-sided cabin at the edge of the valley. When he arrived on horseback the next morning, he expected the worst. He'd prepared himself to find a family in crisis. Children huddled under blankets, walls slick with interior frost, Edwin desperately splitting frozen logs to keep the fire alive. He'd even brought extra supplies: salted pork, flour, 2 wool blankets from a church store. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Edwin was outside, calmly stacking firewood. Not frantically, not desperately, just routine work, the kind a man does when he's not fighting for survival. The woodpile was still substantial, at least 2 cords remaining, maybe more. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line, not the thick black plume of a fire being overfed. Pastor Gaines dismounted and walked closer. The metal siding, coated in a thin layer of frost, reflected the pale winter sunlight. The cabin looked surreal, otherworldly almost, but there was no sign of distress. No frantic activity, no desperation. "Reverend," Edwin said, nodding in greeting. "Wasn't expecting company. Just checking on folks," Gaines replied, trying to keep his voice casual. "Hard winter. Wanted to make sure you had what you needed." Edwin gestured toward the cabin door. "We're doing fine. Come inside. Warm yourself. Stay with me." Because the result humiliated the correct method, and the numbers are about to prove it. Pastor Gaines stepped through the door of Edwin Cortlandt's cabin and stopped cold. The interior was warm. Not lukewarm. Not better than outside. Genuinely, comfortably warm. The kind of warmth that made a man want to remove his coat instead of huddle closer to the fire. The stove in the corner held a low, steady fire. Not roaring. Not consuming log after log in a desperate bid to generate heat. Just a modest flame, burning slow and controlled, with 2 medium-sized pieces of split pine resting on a bed of coals. Margaret was kneading bread at the table. The children, 2 boys and a girl, were playing on the floor near the window, dressed in normal clothes, not buried under layers of woolen blankets. The youngest, barely 4 years old, was barefoot. Barefoot. In February, during the coldest winter Montana had ever recorded. Pastor Gaines looked at the interior walls. No frost, no condensation, no ice forming along the seams where the logs met. The wood was dry, stable, almost warm to the touch. He reached out and placed his palm against the log wall. It wasn't cold. It was neutral, maybe even slightly warm, radiating back the heat that the stove had been producing for hours. "Ow!" He began, then stopped. He didn't know what question to ask first. Edwin closed the door behind them and gestured toward the table. "Sit. I'll put on coffee." As the pastor settled into a chair, Edwin moved to the stove and checked the firebox. He didn't add wood. He just adjusted the damper slightly and let the existing fire continue its slow burn. "We stoked this fire 4 hours ago," Edwin said, his tone matter-of-fact. "It'll hold heat for another 6, maybe 8 hours before we need to add more wood. We burn about a 1/4 cord per week. Maybe less." Pastor Gaines did the math in his head. A 1/4 cord per week, in weather that had most families burning through a full cord or more in the same period. The Schaefers were burning 6 cords every 3 weeks. The Halloran family had exhausted their supply entirely and were now buying wood at inflated prices from town. "How is that possible?" Gaines asked. Edwin sat down across from him. "The metal," he said simply, "it's not conducting cold into the cabin like everyone said it would. It's reflecting heat back in. The air gap between the steel and the logs acts as insulation. The wind can't penetrate. The logs don't expand or contract because they're protected from direct weather. The whole structure holds heat like a stone hearth holds heat, mass plus containment." He stood and walked to the wall, tapping the logs with his knuckle. "Touch this." Gaines stood and placed his hand on the interior log surface. It was dry, solid, and warm. "Now think about every other cabin you've visited this winter," Edwin continued. "Cold walls, frost on the inside, gaps opening up as the logs shift, wind forcing its way through. Those cabins are losing heat faster than the stoves can generate it. This cabin isn't. The heat stays in. The pastor walked slowly around the room, examining the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Everything was dry. No moisture, no mold, no condensation pooling in the corners. The ventilation system Edwin had designed, the air gap with weep holes at the bottom and vents at the top, was working exactly as intended. Moisture that formed was carried away by airflow, never settling on the wood. "What's the temperature in here?" Gaines asked. Edwin glanced at a small mercury thermometer hanging near the door. "Right now? About 70 degrees. It was 68 this morning before we lit the stove. It doesn't drop much overnight because the thermal mass of the logs, combined with the reflective barrier of the metal, retains the heat. Even when the fire dies down to coals, the cabin stays livable. 70 degrees. Gaines thought about the Schaefer cabin, where he'd measured 42 degrees near the stove and 30 degrees in the back corners. He thought about James Hollister's house, where the family slept fully clothed under piles of blankets because the interior temperature dropped into the 20s by dawn. Edwin's cabin, the one everyone had mocked as a death trap, was 70 degrees, with a fire that had been burning for 4 hours, on a quarter cord of wood per week. The numbers didn't just favor Edwin's design. They humiliated the correct method. "I need to tell people," Gaines said quietly. "Tell them what?" Edwin asked. "That you were right. That this works." Edwin shook his head. "They won't believe you. They need to see it themselves. And they need to see the comparison." Pastor Gaines left the Cortland cabin an hour later, but not before taking detailed notes. He measured the interior temperature at multiple points. 71 degrees near the stove, 68 degrees in the farthest corner, 65 degrees near the door. He inspected the walls, the firebox, the woodpile outside. He asked Margaret about condensation, drafts, and moisture problems. She reported none. Then he rode to the Schaefer cabin, just a mile south. The contrast was brutal. Inside the Schaefer home, the fire roared. Mr. Schaefer was feeding it constantly, adding split logs every 20 minutes just to maintain a barely tolerable temperature. The interior walls were slick with frost. Ice had formed in the corners where condensation froze overnight. The children were huddled together under blankets near the stove, shivering despite the flames. Pastor Gaines pulled out his thermometer. 40 degrees near the stove. 32 degrees, literal freezing, in the sleeping area. "How much wood are you burning?" Gaines asked. 2 cords in the last 10 days, Schaefer replied, exhaustion in his voice. "We're running out. I don't know if we'll make it through March." Gaines rode back to town that evening and went straight to James Hollister's house. Hollister was splitting wood in his yard, working by lantern light, his breath visible in the frigid air. "You need to see Cortland's cabin," Gaines said without preamble. Hollister drove the axe into the chopping block and straightened. "I'm not interested in seeing a failure. It's not failing. It's working. Better than any cabin I've ever seen." Hollister stared at him. "What do you mean, working?" 70 degrees inside. Quarter cord of wood per week. No frost on the walls. No drafts. The family is comfortable. The children are warm." Edwin was right. Hollister didn't respond immediately. He looked at the axe embedded in the wood, then at the dwindling pile of split logs beside his cabin. He'd burned 4 cords already. His hands were raw. His back ached. And his family was still cold. "That's not possible," he said finally. "Come see for yourself." 2 days later, Hollister did. He brought Dutch Calb with him, the sawmill foreman who'd predicted that Edwin's cabin would rot from the inside out. They arrived unannounced, skeptical and tired, expecting to find exaggeration or luck or some detail that Pastor Gaines had missed. Edwin opened the door and invited them in without hesitation. The warmth hit them immediately. Hollister pulled off his gloves and flexed his fingers, feeling sensation return. Calb walked to the wall and pressed his hand against the logs, then stepped back and pressed again, as if testing for a trick. "Show us the stove," Hollister said. Edwin opened the firebox. A modest fire burned inside, 2 logs resting on glowing coals, the flames steady but not aggressive. "That's it?" Calb asked. "That's it." Hollister pulled out a small notebook and began taking measurements. Temperature at the stove, 72 degrees. Temperature at the back wall, 67 degrees. Temperature near the door, 64 degrees. He wrote everything down, his handwriting tight and controlled. How much would you burn per day? He asked. 3 to 4 pieces. Maybe 5 if it's particularly cold. Call it a quarter cord per week. Hollister looked up from his notebook. His expression was unreadable. I'm burning a cord every 5 days. Kalb walked the perimeter of the room, inspecting the walls, the corners, the ceiling. There's no condensation, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. No moisture, no rot. The ventilation is working. He turned to Edwin. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air for a moment, simple and direct. Hollister closed his notebook and met Edwin's eyes. How much did the metal cost? $50, all told. Metal, furring strips, fasteners. And you saved? Half my firewood consumption. Maybe more. That's $20 to $30 in labor and hauling per season. The metal pays for itself in 2 winters. After that, it's pure savings. Plus, the logs will last decades longer without weather exposure. Hollister nodded slowly. He didn't apologize, but he didn't need to. The numbers had already spoken. The story of Edwin Cortland's metal-sided cabin spread through Flathead County faster than the cold had. Pastor Gaines told the story at Sunday service, framing it as a lesson in humility and open-mindedness. James Hollister, to his credit, didn't hide his reversal. At the next community meeting at the Grange Hall, he stood up and said plainly, I told Edwin Cortland that his cabin would freeze his family. I was wrong. His design works better than anything I've built in 20 years. The admission shocked the room into silence. Hollister wasn't a man who admitted mistakes easily. His credibility had been built on certainty, on decades of experience. For him, to publicly reverse his position carried weight. Dutch Kalb went further. He wrote out to Edwin's cabin a week later with a request. Show me how you did it. I want to understand the mechanics. Edwin spent 2 hours walking Kalb through the construction process, the furring strips, the air gap, the ventilation system, the metal overlap, the weep holes. He explained the physics as he understood it. Wind barrier, radiant heat reflection, thermal mass retention. Kalb took notes the entire time, asking detailed questions about spacing, materials, and fastening techniques. I've got 3 families asking me to build additions this spring, Kalb said. I'm going to suggest metal siding for all of them. Word reached Kalispell. The hardware store owner, who'd sold Edwin the original metal sheets, started getting inquiries. You got any more of that galvanized steel? The corrugated kind. Demand increased. By late February, the store had sold out of metal siding entirely and had to put in a special order with the supplier in Helena. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Families didn't tear down their existing cabins and rebuild from scratch. That would have been impractical and expensive. But when spring came and construction season began, metal siding became the modification of choice. The Breckenridge family, who'd struggled through the winter burning 5 cords of wood, hired a local carpenter to add metal siding to their cabin's north and west walls, the sides most exposed to wind. The next winter, their fuel consumption dropped by 40%. The Schaefers went further. They wrapped their entire cabin in galvanized steel, following Edwin's design almost exactly. Mrs. Schaefer, who developed frostbite the previous winter, reported that the interior temperature stayed consistently above 60 degrees, even on the coldest nights, with half the firewood they'd used before. By the spring of 1893, just 2 years after Edwin had completed his controversial build, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated metal siding into their design. Some used full wraps. Others used partial cladding on the most wind-exposed walls. A few experimented with different air gap widths or ventilation configurations. But the core principle remained the same: an outer metal shell that sealed the structure, reflected heat, and protected the logs from direct weather. The technique became known locally as Cortland cladding, though Edwin never sought credit or tried to profit from the idea. He shared the design freely with anyone who asked, even helping neighbors with the initial layout and fastening to make sure they got the ventilation right. James Hollister, the builder who'd once called the design dangerous, became one of its most vocal advocates. He started offering metal siding as a standard option for new construction, and by 1894, nearly half of his projects included it. It's not traditional, he told clients, but it works. And in country this cold, working matters more than looking like everyone else. The social cost that Edwin and Margaret had paid didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. Invitations to community gatherings resumed. Conversations at church became less strained. The Cortland family was no longer seen as reckless or foolish. They were seen as innovators who'd solved a problem everyone else had simply endured. Margaret noticed the change most clearly in the small gestures. Women who'd once offered pity now asked for advice. "How do you keep your cabin so warm? Should we try the metal?" She answered patiently, without bitterness, explaining the ventilation, the air gap, the importance of proper installation. Edwin's children, who'd once asked if their house would freeze them, now overheard other children talking about the smart cabin or the warm house. The mockery had been replaced by curiosity. The winter of 1893 to 94 brought another brutal cold snap, though not as severe as 1891. Temperatures dropped into the negative teens. Wind howled across the valley. And this time, the families with metal-sided cabins, the ones who'd adopted Edwin's design, burned through the season with half the wood consumption of their neighbors. The proof was no longer anecdotal. It was measurable, repeatable, and undeniable. Even the skeptics who'd held out, clinging to traditional methods, began to reconsider. One by one, they made the modifications. By 1895, metal siding had become so common in Flathead County that new settlers arriving in the area assumed it was standard frontier construction. The technique spread beyond Montana. Homesteaders in Wyoming and Idaho, hearing about the metal cabin method through word of mouth and territorial newspapers, began experimenting with similar designs. The concept adapted to local conditions. Some regions used different metals, others adjusted the air gap based on humidity levels, but the core innovation remained, a sealed outer shell that worked with physics instead of against it. Edwin never wrote a manual or published instructions. He didn't patent the design or try to commercialize it. He simply kept living in his cabin, burning a quarter cord of wood per week, watching his children grow up warm and healthy. On cold winter evenings, when the wind screamed across the valley and the metal siding sang with the vibration, Edwin would sit by the stove and think about the winter of 1891. The mockery, the isolation, the doubt, and the moment when Pastor Gaines had stepped through his door and realized that everything they believed about cold and shelter and survival had been wrong. He wasn't being reckless. He was being practical. And sometimes, the most practical thing a man can do is ignore what everyone else thinks is correct and trust what the numbers prove is true. 75 degrees warmer. That's not a guess. That's not an exaggeration. That's the measured difference between Edwin Cortland's metal-sided cabin and the standard log cabins of Flathead County during the winter of 1891, the coldest winter Montana had ever recorded. While families burned through cords of firewood and still woke to frost on their interior walls, Edwin's family stayed warm with half the fuel and zero condensation problems. The metal siding that everyone called dangerous, foolish, and doomed to fail became the single most copied building modification in the region within 3 years. The lesson isn't just about construction techniques or thermal envelopes or frontier ingenuity. It's about the difference between doing what's accepted and doing what works. Edwin Cortland didn't care if his cabin looked like a grain silo. He cared if it kept his family alive. And when the test came, when the coldest winter in history locked the valley in ice, his foolish design didn't just survive. It thrived. Traditional wisdom isn't always right. Sometimes the mockery comes before the mastery. Sometimes the idea everyone laughs at is the one that changes everything. So here's the question for you. Which part of this solution would you apply to your own home today? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If this story taught you something, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you a real technique that worked when lives depended on it. And if you want to see more forgotten survival wisdom, check out the video we're putting on screen right now. Stay warm, stay smart, and never let the crowd convince you that practical is impossible. Educational note: This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.